Right now, I want to welcome the author of the brand new book, When Deadly Force is Involved, a look at the legal side of stand your ground, duty to retreat, and other questions of self-defense. Retired Major General Bruce Lawlor is with us on the program. General, how are you, sir?
Good, Cam. How are you?
I am fantastic. I appreciate you coming on the show today. I've been hearing about this book for months. Our mutual friend John Ford, firearms instructor down here in the Farmville area, has been so excited about this. And I got to tell you, I started reading this book, and I'm excited about it too, General, because you're talking about some really important issues, and you're doing it in a way. Look, I'll be honest with you. This book could have been really dry. You know, you talk about the legal side of these things. But this is not a dry, legalistic book. You're telling stories in this book, and you're bringing to life these legal points that you're trying to make through real individuals all around the country.
That's right. We tried to use cases that actually occurred. Each of the stories are based on a court case in which a person was involved in a deadly confrontation. And then the person was accused of murder and defended with a claim of self-defense. And so by looking at them and putting them together, you begin to get an understanding of how the law looks at self-defense claims, and perhaps you have a framework to begin thinking about the whole idea of carrying a firearm for purposes of self-defense.
What made you decide that this was something that you wanted to write about and investigate?
Well, you know, Cam, it comes from working in the Homeland Security arena. I've worked in it a long time, was sort of there at the beginning of Homeland Security. And we have spent billions and billions of dollars thinking about what state and federal governments, local governments, private sector companies can do to protect the systems that we all rely on, transportation systems, water systems, and so forth. But we really haven't spent a lot of time thinking about what role the individual plays for his or her own safety in this new security environment we have, and what an individual can do to keep themselves safe. And when you start thinking about that problem in the context of Homeland Security, inevitably you come to a point in time where each of us, for some period of time, sometimes longer, sometimes shorter, but during a period of time, we're on our own. We have to rely on ourselves for our own safety and our own well-being and those of our family. And so the question becomes then, what can you do about it? And, of course, the right of self-defense is one of those options. It's not for everybody, but it is an option for people who are prepared to prepare for that eventuality if it should occur. So I thought we needed to think a little bit harder about how the law would look at that. What circumstances would enable a person to actually employ self-defense? What kinds of situations could people find themselves in where they would be justified in using it or not justified? And that led to the whole idea of telling stories.
So I want to ask you a couple of questions about what your book covers. But from a Homeland Security perspective, if we can go back for just 1 second here, because we were talking about this the other day right here on the program. The former head of Interpol, Ron Noble, talked several years ago, I think it was 2013, after the attack in Nairobi, Kenya. He talked with ABC News about how his mindset had changed. He used to be not a fan, not a real believer in the idea of civilians owning firearms and stopping or preventing these terror attacks. And then the more he started looking at what happened in Nairobi, Kenya, he found the presence of civilians who were able to save lives, and B, he wondered, if this was an attack in a place like Colorado or Texas, where the presence of armed citizens maybe would have been much more prevalent, what kind of impact that would have made. Have you seen that change in thinking from others in the Homeland Security apparatus over the years? Has there been a move towards recognizing, as you say, that there's going to be a period of time when individuals are on their own, and that you can't harden up every target out there, that armed citizens have a role to play, not only in our personal security, but collectively in our national security?
Well, I think there has been a change in thinking, and I think it has to do directly with the nature of the threat. The threat has sort of evolved in a way that we feared but somewhat expected, and that is we've gone from very complex operations like we saw in 9/11. Those are the kind of operations that require a lot of logistics in order to organize and execute. And in those cases, it's pretty easy. I won't say it's pretty easy, but it's easier for the federal government and other authorities to uncover the preliminary activities that are needed preparation for the attack. It has metastasized now. It's decentralized. And so we're seeing many more what I would call individual attacks using firearms, or now we're beginning to see motor vehicles. And those are the attacks are distributed. And that's created a little bit more anxiety, I think, in people. We used to never worry about going to movie theaters or churches or nightclubs or places like that because the idea of individual violence in those places wasn't necessarily on our minds. Today, not so much. It's a little differently. So you see with the distribution, the decentralization of the threat, you're also seeing people begin to think about the response also needs to be decentralized. And that means, frankly, that the individual begins to play a more important role in his or her own self-defense. The other issue you raised is one of the reasons that you see some movement in this direction is because the idea of randomness. The whole question of who the terrorist will encounter if they intend to attack is an important one. And I think there would have been a different outcome if the attack that occurred in Africa had occurred in an American city today.
Well, and clearly we know that these terrorists are looking to strike whoever they can. A civilian who is armed with a fire may not be able to prevent every attack out there, but given the varied and random nature of the threat, as you say, there may be times where that would be helpful. So let's talk about some of these concepts in your book when deadly force is involved, because one of the things that I see on a fairly regular basis, General, in media reports about whether it's a self-defense shooting or a court action, there's a lot of confusion between the idea of stand your ground, duty to retreat, and Castle Doctrine. Those terms seem to be used almost interchangeably by the media. Is that correct? Is that proper?
Well, it's not proper, but you're right. There is confusion in that area, and particularly with respect to the Castle Doctrine. And it really is all related to the duty to retreat, which is a concept that comes out of English common law and was brought to this country by the colonists. And basically that says, as you know, that before a person can employ deadly force, he or she must make every reasonable effort to escape, to avoid having to employ deadly force. That idea began to be eroded as early as 1876 in a case in Ohio in which the court said, hey, if a person is attacked suddenly without warning, there's no time to retreat, there's no duty to retreat. That, in turn, led to another case in the next year in Indiana in which it went a little bit further and said, hey, if a person is lawfully doing whatever it is they're doing, they have a right to be where they are, they're not provoking anybody, they shouldn't have to retreat in the face of intimidation, unlawful intimidation. And that's sort of the genesis of stand your ground laws. And that idea that a person who is not at fault in lawful conduct should not have to flee has sort of taken over. So today we've probably got maybe 30 to 35 states have adopted that concept that a person who's innocent and performing lawfully doesn't have to retreat. Now, the Castle Doctrine is a form of duty to retreat, and that's where some real confusion comes in, because the Castle Doctrine started with the idea that when you're in your own home, you should never have to run. You should never have to retreat and try to find a way out of your home. It's your home to defend. And many people confuse that and seem to think that it's a license to fire, to shoot someone that's inside the house, and that's not true. The person who's in the home still has to present all the other requirements for a deadly force situation. There has to be a deadly threat. It has to be imminent. There has to be reasonable fear of death or serious bodily injury. Those are the kinds of aspects that still all have to be in the equation before a person, even within their own home, can legitimately use deadly force to protect themselves. So there's a lot of confusion in it, not necessarily helped by some of the reporting that tends to conflate duty to retreat and Castle Doctrine, and so it becomes a little confusing.
Well, it does, and I think that you're right. When you have reporters who are reporting on this issue and they don't necessarily know all of the facts, they're not attorneys. They've got maybe 10 minutes to prepare a report, and they're not going to be able to get through all the background. I can understand how some false information can get out there. I just wish that it were actually corrected when it does, because I think that you're right. I think that there is oftentimes this presumption on the part of news media that Castle Doctrine is exactly as you say, well, if you're in your home, then the rules fly out the window. And so, no, I think it's a very good point that you note that in order to use deadly force, it doesn't matter if you're in your home, if you were in public, there has to be that criteria that must be met in order for that force to be justified and lawful.
Absolutely. I mean, the overwhelming question, I think, in every single case, it boils down to, was it really necessary to take a life to save your own? Was it really something you had to do in order to save yourself? And that's the question, ultimately, that all of it tries to answer. It's the question of what your intent was, and did you provoke anything? It's all designed to understand whether this was really necessary, because life's important.
So, absolutely. So let me ask about another question that commonly comes up. We saw this case in Oklahoma recently, where 3 individuals break into a home, and the homeowner's son is there. They didn't think that anybody was at home. One was armed with a knife. One had a pair of brass knuckles. But the homeowner's son didn't know that they were armed. He didn't know anything about it. He just heard the break-in. He grabbed his rifle. He shot and killed 2 of the intruders. One of them got away. Actually, he shot and killed all 3. One of them got outside of the home. The getaway driver's been arrested. And I've heard a couple of comments, General, about, well, how could this guy do that? He didn't know that these guys were armed, or it was an unfair fight because he had a rifle and these intruders only had a knife and brass knuckles. When you are at home, somebody breaks in, you aren't necessarily going to be able to determine, okay, I can tell that this guy has a firearm on him. What is the law regarding the assumption that somebody breaks into your home, not with the intent to give you Girl Scout cookies, but with the intent to do harm or to do ill will once he's inside?
Well, in every situation, of course, the facts are incredibly important. They're dispositive, and small changes in those facts can result in very big changes in the outcome. So as I recall that case, the folks that broke into the home were wearing masks. I think it was ski masks or something like that. So that fact alone suggests hostile intent. People don't come breaking into your home with ski masks to sell Girl Scout cookies. And so the circumstances were such at that point, the person's in his own home. He's confronted by 3 people who I believe were wearing masks. They broke into the home. At that point, he has evidence of hostile intent. He has evidence of a threat directed at him personally. It's imminent. It's not going to be next week or next year. It's right now. He's got to do something right now to avoid harm. And is it reasonable for him to be afraid under the circumstances that he might be killed or seriously injured? And the answer to all those questions is yes.
Okay. And that's, again, a very different scenario than, let's say, waking up at 3 o'clock in the morning and finding somebody asleep on your couch.
That's
right. And we.
That's exactly right. I mean, I've talked to 3 separate. I've had 3 separate interviews in the last 2 days on this very, very question. Interestingly, every single one of the people who were talking to me said that they had been involved in a situation where a person had got into their apartment. In some cases, was confused. One case, he was drunk. I mean, they did not employ deadly force. Thank God, it was not appropriate. But there was clearly no hostile intent. There was no deadly threat involved in the person coming into the house. And so, and one of the individuals told me that he himself had done it mistakenly one evening, walked into somebody else's apartment. So trespass, the penalty for trespass is not death, but at the same time, someone that's in your home that's unknown immediately raises the stakes, and I think the way to handle it is to assume that there's a hostile intent until you know there isn't.
Absolutely. Again, we're speaking with Major General Bruce Lawlor. The new book is called When Deadly Force is Involved. They look at the legal side of stand your ground, duty to retreat, and other questions of self-defense. We're almost out of time, General. Listen, I really do appreciate you joining us on the program. One last question for you. Talk about, if you can, the process of writing this book, because I would imagine that you relied on not just your own knowledge, but also going to outside experts. So who did you talk to in researching this book?
Well, a lot of it was done, frankly, in the law libraries, identifying the elements of self-defense, and then trying to research through the cases to identify stories that would highlight the particular element of the defense that you wanted to talk about. So, for example, there was a story in there that is focused on the intent of the person who pulls the trigger. What's the difference between hostile intent and the desire to avoid being injured, and how do you determine that? How do you understand it? Cases in there about what's provocation. When is the shooter responsible for contributing to the encounter that leads to the victim's death? Each case, there were multiple cases that were looked at in order to select a story. And then once you have the story, you craft it. And I talked to some prosecutors. I asked some folks about, particularly the last chapter, about the discussion that occurs between a prosecutor and a police officer about whether to bring a case of murder versus self-defense. Those kinds of people were the ones that were involved in it. I didn't necessarily talk to people who were actually involved in the cases, because I thought that would sort of skewer it one way or the other, and I thought best to just stick with the facts as set forth in the written cases.
Well, as I said, it is a fantastic book. I cannot thank you enough for being on the program today. Thank you for your research and your efforts in writing When Deadly Force is Involved, and I hope we get a chance to talk again soon, sir.
Yeah, and say hi to John for me. He's a good man.
I certainly will. Retired Major General Bruce Lawlor with us. Again, the new book is called When Deadly Force is Involved. They look at the legal side of stand your ground, duty to retreat, and other questions of self-defense. It is out now. We do appreciate General Lawlor joining us here on the program.